Okay, this is another one that I'm not going to make public because I haven't brushed my teeth or combed my hair or anything. This is the new apartment, 0115, and it's 4:12 in the morning, 4:12 a.m. on, let's see, today is, well, it's September 1st, 2022. I don't remember the day. I'm guessing, I think it's Wednesday, but I'm not sure. This is a first floor apartment, and right away I noticed there's a minor problem with there's not a doormat or so there's mud outside where there's supposed to be uh, grass or shrubbery, and there is no doormat to wipe your feet. So I did put an old white t-shirt down, and I'm trying to stay off the carpet right away and wipe my shoes off on that. So now this is not voluntary here. The voice from outer space is sort of ordering me with headaches, migraine headaches, and sleep discrepancies to give a report on here. So this is, private. This would be considered a rehearsal for something else. I was in apartment 2408, and in order to extend the lease on that for a furnished apartment, they needed some kind of deadline notice. So, in other words, for me to extend that at that rate, if I knew about it, that was probably 2 weeks ago. They did briefly put it on their website yesterday, but since I was moving, I didn't have time to phone. And secondly, I've already phoned. I asked them about that apartment on the phone a couple weeks ago, and the customer service who answered said, "Well, what does it say on the internet?" And it said I was too late to extend the stay in 2408. So he said, "Well, I guess that's it." I did ask him on the phone if after I'd missed the deadline, if the stay at 24/8 could be extended, and he said it was just whatever the internet said. So most of the time, the internet has said that that one is not available. Someone else apparently rented it, or they took it off the website. The reason is because it's a larger apartment. It's almost twice as large as this one. This one is a lower rate. With this one, I think I'm at 1400 total. With that one, I was at about 1650 total. But were I to rent it another month without being part of their 6 month club, then that one would be 1800 or something like that. So here I'm down at 1400. That one, if I rented it a whole month, I was thinking of renting it for 3/4 of a month. And as I said, I was only briefly on the internet for one day, and their customer service told me uh, that they don't do it on the phone on that one or something. It's just whatever the internet says. So I don't know. So anyway, I didn't meet their deadline to extend that larger two-bedroom place, so now I'm in a first floor, one-bedroom place. The first floor will be easier because I won't have to worry about slipping, falling down the stairs. And I see they have different shades on the windows here a little, but it is significantly smaller, so I'll have more of a problem with storing stuff. So hopefully I'll feel like throwing more of it away. I now just realized, with the voice from space, that I had left clothing at that storage in Florida. Now the thinking there would be I have a little time here, maybe that would be small enough to get at and eliminate that before the deadline of the 10th. Today's the 1st. Uh, I don't think yesterday was Monday. I think yesterday was Tuesday or Wednesday. Today's Thursday or Wednesday. As I said, this is a rehearsal. I'm not planning to, put this voluntarily on the internet. Um, So now I am at a comb the hair stage. Another thing I could do is I could chop it all off again, or I could finally go to a barber. It's 2022. I don't think I've been to a barber since 2019. So I've just been chopping all my hair off. I apparently have not bought an electric razor to trim it. I was hoping I'd figure out how to trim it when it's short, so then I don't have to think about it, and I haven't been doing that. Uh, so, uh, and then the problem I had moving in yesterday, the moving was going okay. I got out by 11:30 with an 11 a.m. deadline. And I left their keys in the lock and another set on the kitchen counter and their Hello Landing card. It was relatively clean. It's just the bathroom, I accidentally urinated on the bathroom floor mat or bathroom rug. So that maybe they know how to wash it or they put out a new one. I don't know. But other than that, it looked okay to me. Now I had more storage space there if I knew about it. I did use the spare bedroom for its large walk-in closet and a couple drawers in the chests of drawers or whatever you call those. Uh, so that's that. Now the problem I had, what led to this here, where the voice has been ordering me. First of all, it wants me to tell people who I vote for, even though I'm a local person. Local people normally are not described as, unless they want to be. They normally, when I was, back in the day and growing up, local people did not have to reveal political opinions if they didn't want to. I guess this voice from outer space claims that all national people have to either be left-wing Democrats or right-wing Republicans, so I don't really believe that. And but local people can be independent, not declare a political party like at the local village boards and local school boards. They can just run for things as themselves. And that political party stuff is to raise money for national candidates like senator, congressman, president. So um, just to go over that, in the last election, I voted for the Democrat Biden. In the election before that, in 2016, I've generally been against voting for billionaires for president. So in the last election, 2020, there were two billionaires in the Democratic primary, and I did not vote for either of them. And then I haven't declared or openly announced being part of a political party since the 1970s. Then in 2016, a influential billionaire from at that time New York, or now I guess Florida, Donald Trump ran, and I did not vote for him. I voted for Hillary Clinton, the Democrat. Now, the voice has been pointing out that I don't, according to this voice, I don't remind people of those individuals. Well, that's not a law in the United States. I did not campaign for Clinton or Biden, so I'm under no rule that I have to, remind people of Clinton or Biden. I just voted for them in those elections. What I was going to say is the candidates I was most interested in the 2000 recent elections, 2020, where I voted for one independent and one write-in, and uh, they're not part of the two main political parties, so I was not I was mostly interested in an independent and a write-in, but when the presidential race came around, I normally am an independent person who votes for candidates in both parties. So in 2020, I voted for the Democrat Biden, and I did not campaign for him or volunteer. And in 2016, I voted for the Democrat Clinton, and I did not campaign for her or volunteer. And there is no rule that your personality reminds people of other people or whatever. That doesn't make any. Who's ever sending that out probably isn't from the United States. That's what I'm claiming. That's why I'm calling it a space voice. I think that is rich, powerful people in foreign countries and United States. In 2012, I voted for the Republican Romney, and he did not get elected. And in 2008, I wanted to vote. I thought I obeyed the rules and filled out the voting material in Texas. I was very busy. I had half a dozen employers that year, and I was going to 2 and 3 jobs at once. So my average work week was 80 to 110 hours. I filled out the materials to register to vote in Texas, and they didn't mail me the approval until 2 weeks after the presidential election. I don't know why that happened. I thought I met their deadlines of 30 days notice, 60 days, or 90, whatever their notice was. I thought I met it. So I was not allowed to vote in the 2008 election as I was working on half a dozen employers and 2 and 3 jobs simultaneously. I was a jobber that year, and I was very busy at 80 to 110-hour work weeks in 2008. In 2004, I voted for the Democrat. I believe his name was Kerry, and he did not get elected. In 2000, I voted for the Republican. That was the last time I voted for a Republican presidential candidate who got elected. In 2000, I voted for the Republican George Bush Jr., and he was elected. In 1996, I voted for the incumbent president, the Democrat William Clinton. In 1996, and he was elected. In 1996. Let me just see if I got this straight again. In 1996, I voted for the Democrat Clinton. He was the incumbent. It was a voluntary vote. I was not ordered or forced to vote for him. Now that comes up with me because Trump or whoever, they have a debate now that the elections are rigged or whatever. I thought the 2020 election was no more rigged or no more corrupted than the other elections in the United States. Of course, they could all use improvement. None of them have been perfect, but I think Trump complained too much for the gravity of the thing. The 2020 election was a regular, similar to other ones. Again, this is why I mentioned this. Both the national political parties probably cheat a little, and so Trump has been complaining about it quite a bit and claiming it was a 100% rigged election. When I'm using the word rigged, I'm saying 1% of it or 2% of it is imperfect or screwed up or has mistakes. So I don't agree with Trump's thing that the election is so messed up with errors that therefore he should be president and the whole result should be thrown out. Again, I did not vote for him in 2016, so I don't, and that issue, I feel he's sort of bipartisan or nonpartisan, or he's sort of a Democrat where he's pointing out that many of the modern day elections have been a minor corruption in them at 1% corrupt or something. I don't think they're entirely corrupt as he says. So that was 1996. I voluntarily voted for Clinton and he was elected. In 1992, I'm going to throw that one out because I was ordered who to vote for, and I think the same candidates would have been elected, but I was not voting freely. I'm normally a nonpartisan independent voter, So meaning I normally vote for candidates in both the major political parties and maybe some third party candidates. So in that one, I was ordered where it was against my will, where I would have voted for the Democrat. I was ordered to vote for the Republican in that race, and in another race where I would have voted for the Republican, I was ordered to vote for the Democrat, and where I would have voted for an independent or a write-in, I was ordered to vote for a Republican or a Democrat. So whoever was doing that, corrupted that in my case. And but I did not think it was serious enough that it affected the overall election. I think all the same candidates would have been elected. So I'm not involved in politics much. I don't have much to do with it. So I just ignore that one and throw that one out. I'm normally a nonpartisan, independent voter, and I don't. It's just the ones who got elected that year got elected. In 1990, again, that off your election with the presidential races, I was ordered who to vote for against my will. And again, combinations of both Democrats and Republicans, where who's ever doing that ordered me to vote the opposite in each race. Whereas in that local race, I would have voted for this candidate, I was ordered to vote for somebody else. Whereas in that state race, I would have voted for the Democrat, I was ordered to vote for the Republican. Whereas in that national race, I would have voted or whatever for senator, would have voted for the Republican or whatever, I was ordered to vote for the Democrat. So I'm just ignoring that. I don't wish to. The reason is the people doing that want to get revenge for it or something. I'm not interested in that. That did not make sense to me that anyone did that, and I didn't think it affected the overall elections. I think the same candidates got elected who would have been elected. Then in the 1988 election, it was just a little different. I'm throwing that one out in my case. Again, I don't think it affected the national result. I normally vote for two parties. I was ordered to vote for one party in that case. And I don't think it affected any of the national or state results or anything. I think it was just a one voter, one vote situation. So I'm not interested in retaliating or getting revenge or anything like that. It's most of the time I vote for combinations of Democrats and Republicans. And whoever was doing that in 1990 and 1992 was ordered me to vote for the opposite in each race of what I would have voted for. Then they stopped that after 1992, and they claimed in my case that bullying would be over forever. And so, as far as I know, it was. The elections after that were always voluntary and so on. So, 88, I'm throwing out again. As I recall, if my memory is correct, I was ordered to vote for one political party, whereas some of the locals don't name a political party, and where I would normally have voted for candidates in both political parties. So I'm not real predictable with politics. I've never worked in it, and I've never run for an office any place, and so I have little to do with it. Now 1984 goes back to a normal election where I'm voting freely. I voted for the Democrat Walter Mondale in the presidential race. I may have followed my father's advice and voted for all Democrats. That was, my father was in his last year. He died at age 73 of cancer. And he gave me some advice after I voted for Reagan in 1980. He advised me to vote just for one political party, and he advised me to vote just for all Democrats. In 1984, I probably voted for some candidates in both political parties, but maybe I did vote for all Democrats. I don't remember. On the presidential race, I voted for the Democrat challenger who lost to Reagan. I voted for the Democrat Walter Mondale. In 1980, was living in my parents' house, and I did bother my father a little. We normally keep it private. He doesn't normally tell me who he votes for. If I don't ask him, I never know. My mother tells me a general party that she supported most of the time, but she was never officially a member of that party, never campaigned for them or anything. So in 1980, I voted for the Republican Reagan for president, as a lot of Democrats swung over, or a lot of independents crossed over. So I voted for Reagan, who was very popular and got elected that year in 1980. And my father did, he saw I was not as active as I should have been with employment. I worked just mostly at the local. I graduated from college in 1980, so I believe I voted for Reagan uh, in my last semester of college. I was late. I had to drop some classes, so I was 4.5 years to get a Bachelor of Arts degree with a B grade point average. So I being a senior, late in my 4.5 semester, in November, I voted for the Republican Reagan in that one, who was very popular, and he got crossover voters from independents. I regard myself as sort of an independent. My father, I was living in his house, and he was against that. So he pointed out, around that time that he doesn't normally comment on politics, and my mother does normally comment on it. So he pointed out that in Milwaukee, if you vote for all one party, even though it's supposedly a private voting booth, and I'm saying all throughout this, it's not private, that rich people spy on that and tell people in all the elections I voted in. So my voting has never been private throughout my entire lifetime, and I didn't always know that. My father sort of knew about that, and he advised me, you're better off voting for just one party in there because it'll help you with employment. So I graduated in December of 1980 with a Bachelor of Arts degree and a B grade point average, which matches skills and abilities testing. I've never tested off the charts. I got like skills, abilities, IQ testing, 90 in math, 87 in English, and 83 in science. The 83 in science is at the high end of average. Average is 75 to 83. So my scores are a little above that. The creative writing component of general English, I'm at 90, which is above the average of 83. The reading comprehension component, which is what gets me into trouble in life, I test at 83 in reading comprehension, so that's average. So that's where I have problems with memory, is scatterbrain memory, and reading comprehension. Only 83 is average. Overall English 87, since I did work at newspapers 5 years. 87 is above average, but it's obviously not off the charts. The creative writing component of English 90, that's above the average of 83, but it's not in the genius category, which would be up at 99 or 100 or whatever. It's not off the charts. So, what was I going to say? I crossed over and voted for Reagan, and my father, normally we don't discuss politics much, but he pointed out, you now you graduated with a bachelor's degree, and you've only been working full time at Sears, which is retailing, which you don't have to have a college degree for that back in those days. But Sears hires college degreed people and put them out on their sales floor back in those days. So I was in men's clothing originally, and I also did shoes. Shoes was a lot better because it offered a commission. So there were a couple other college people around. One was a computer science student who was still in college, and another one was a graduate who needed money to go to law school. So there are three of us with college backgrounds. The second time I worked at Sears in approximately 1991, there was only one other person with a college degree or college background. And then I was part-time freelance with community newspapers, the weekly chain, and at that point, that's where I was coming from. So then, 1976 was the first year I voted. I don't know if I voted for entirely for one political party. I don't remember, but I voted for the Democratic candidate, Jimmy Carter. That was filed after Watergate and after Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon. So the odds on me voting for the Republican in that race were zero. Gerald Ford was a Republican president who was not elected. He became president after Nixon resigned. I felt Nixon was guilty in Watergate. I felt, 99% of those folks in Watergate were sent to jail or prison or a military brig or some kind of confinement. So just, reading about that in high school and watching it on TV, I felt most of those people looked like they were guilty and were covering things up. The main crime most of the white collars were being accused of was covering up, knowing of illegalities in the government and not not policing them. Of course, the plumbers unit or whoever they were guilty of breaking and entering. So, the odds on me voting for a Republican presidential candidate in that one were pretty much zero. Gerald Ford pardons Richard Nixon. 99% of the other people all went to jail, military brig, or prison or something. So 99% of them were found guilty involved in the cover-up investigations. So I voted for Carter, and he was elected president, and he was one term, one term only. And back in those days, it must have been the phase that the government was in. Ever since JFK was elected, they kept asking people to uh, do things for the society voluntarily, or that started with John F. Kennedy, where he asked people to voluntarily do stuff for the government. um, I think that that doesn't seem realistic. Most people need to support themselves and have to be paid. So I don't know what that's talking about. Um, but so let's just to review that. Now this is coming from a voice from outer space, making me reveal this. The first election, I can only remember the presidential vote. I might have voted for all Democrats. I don't remember. But I did vote for the Democrat, Jimmy Carter, in that one, who was elected one term, and it was due to Watergate, where 99% of those people were found guilty and sentenced for something, and Nixon was pardoned. So my first election to vote in at age 18 out of high school, so I did not vote for the Republican Gerald Ford because he pardoned Nixon, and I can see clearly those people are all aware of illegal, that's a high school kid they're talking to in my case. Okay, so the first election I voted for Carter, and well, I'm not going to go over them again, I just named them. The voice is trying to make me repeat them again. That's because it keeps arguing with me, so that's supposedly in the science fiction section. I'm not supposed to be having any voice arguing with me about politics for two main reasons. One, because that's illegal, or to me it sounds illegal. It violates the sanctity of my inner mind and it violates my privacy. But two, the thing kind of deal with me long ago, and of course it's not following it like I'm used to. Since I read through science fiction at the library back in the 1990s and on into the early 2000s, I'm not supposed to be interrogated about who I vote for. I'm supposed to be a free voter like anyone else. Also, all the science fiction movies and TV shows. Because they're the ones with most of the uniforms, action and adventure in movies, and science fiction and fantasy in books and novels, they're the ones that have most of the uniforms in them. So I read through that and watched that back in the 1990s and early 2000s. So I'm not supposed to, they're supposed to be leaving me alone on that issue. Now, it's more interesting back in the past, so maybe I should move this up forward. But my first election, I was at Nicolay High School. Only one can Our school was the top public school in the state. Only one candidate visited it. He was a liberal Democrat named Morris Udall from Utah. I believe I read 5 or 10 years later that he switched. At that time, he was a liberal Democrat, and I believe I read after the election, 5 or 10 years later, that he's no longer public that I know of. He's a farmer or something from Utah at that time. And I believe I read 10 years later that he had switched to now become a right wing Republican. Anyway, I voted for him as a liberal Democrat in 1976, the primaries, because he was the only candidate who visited our high school. None of the other candidates visited our high school. So, since he visited the high school, I paid him back. I campaigned for him for 1 day or one weekend, I think it was, only 1 or 2 weekends. I went down to an office in downtown Milwaukee as a volunteer, and I don't remember meeting a lot of people, and I was at a phone bank, and I campaigned for him for 1 or 2 weekends over the phone as a volunteer. In 1976, the Liberal Democrat Morris Udall, who later, somewhere I read the newspaper, he claimed he became a Republican or something 10 years later. I really did not pay a lot of attention to that. And then that was one thing. Now, prior to that, I was on the forensics team in high school, and I was on it for 3 years. And none of my original oratories, I did 4 minute original oratory as a sophomore, and 8 minute original oratory as a junior and senior. And none of my original oratories supported either of the two major political parties. The first year, I read out loud an essay I wrote for a communications class called My Vision of a Utopic Society, or My Vision of a Utopia. So according to me, it was nonpartisan. Then the next 2 years, I did two different original speeches. That was the rule. You read out loud an original talk or original speech, not somebody else's speech. So none of them were directly involved politics. I was in a fraternity in college, the Psi chapter, I believe it was, of Theta Chi fraternity. I was an active member for 2 years. I lived in the frat house the first year, and then I lived in an off-campus apartment the next year. I was in the fraternity as a junior and senior in college at UW-Madison, so I joined late, so I had not prepared in advance. So even though it was a popular chapter with over 100 active members, I did not run for any office. I did inquire about the writer, and the writing position seemed to be in good hands with a fellow named Kevin. He seemed to be doing okay. So that's normally not a real active, they were just leaving him as writer, normally not a real contested election. So I didn't run for anything. Like I said, I just did my volunteer part, volunteering in the kitchen, which is what everyone did. We had a volunteer schedule to help out in cleaning the kitchen, washing dishes. And I voluntarily answered the door because I was in I forgot what you call it. I originally was not a member of the fraternity. I was what they call a boarder, which means they have a few large rooms at the front of the house because of the fraternity parties. So they usually rent them out to private citizens who are not in the fraternity. And I came out to the campus late that year. I was a junior that year, and I decided to go to UW-Madison late. So I accepted the border room at the front of the house, a large room, but they're known to be loud because of the upstairs, and an upstairs living room. There's a frat party every 2 weeks in the fall semester. Back then, in those days, that was approximately 1978, 1979. So I didn't run for any offices there either. And then, I've never run for an office any place. And as I said, the last time I volunteered in an election in the United States was in 1976 when I was a high school senior. I did volunteer to for 1 or 2 weekends to do a phone bank to. I like those old things better where you go in person and you don't have to figure it out on the internet. You just, dial a landline telephone. So I volunteered to campaign for the liberal Democrat Morris Udall because he was the only candidate who visited our high school, Nicolay High School. No other presidential candidates visited or ran at that high school. He was the only one. So then, prior to that, our involvement was the prior to that, our involvement was when I was a little kid, a toddler. When my sister and I were very young, I was born in 1957 and my sister in 1960. So when I was in the 1960s, JFK, John F. Kennedy, visited my father's place of employment. He worked at that time for 25 years as a department manager at Schuster's department store, which was a big local one in Milwaukee. It was the biggest one in downtown Milwaukee. Schuster's probably later became Boston Store and Gimbel's, and then those, like all the national chains, those eventually went out of business. I believe a lot of national chains and department store retailing have gone out of business over the years. There have been so many of them. Nowadays, they don't have so many of them, only like, Walmart and Target and Penny's and whatever, Costco or whatever, Sam's Club. Back in those days, they had a lot of small independent ones, and a lot of times the local one was the largest one, like in the downtown of a city. So my father worked at Schuster's down there, downtown, for 25 years. It was the largest one in Milwaukee in those days in the 1950s or 40s or 1960s. And JFK, I believe, had been elected and he was running for re-election or something. I don't remember, but we had a picture on our my mother and father's living room at their houses. We had a black and white photo of my father giving JFK a cake in a box when when he was campaigning, either in the 1950s or 1960s. Um, so maybe it was the first time he ran before he was elected. I don't remember, but in any event, it had a photograph of my father giving JFK a white cake in a box at the Schuster's department store, and that sat on my mother and father's bookshelf for many decades. I've looked at it many times. My father gives JFK a white box with a cake in it. Probably from Milwaukee, it was probably a German chocolate cake, but I don't really know. But in any event, Kennedy did not immediately open it up or start eating it or anything right away. My father just, gives him a cake in a box. And back in those days, it was probably the 1950s, but maybe it was the 1960s. Back in those days, they just snap a black and white photograph of it, and it sat on my parents' bookshelf for many years and decades. My father, I asked him once. He would not normally tell me unless I asked him. I asked him once, and he said he was a rank and file Democrat and voted for all Democrats. And now I remember the reason why. We have a Polish surname, Kujawski, 3 syllables, Kujawski, Kujawski. Well, back in those days, the 1950s and 60s, the only I being a toddler, certainly not an expert, but the only person we knew of who was Polish in the national government was Clement Zablocki. He was a friend of my father's, and he also worked at Schuster's department store where Kennedy visited. That's probably why Kennedy visited. So Clement Zablocki had a Polish ethnic name, and he was elected as a U.S. congressman. And as I said, he was a business associate of my father's, where they both worked as department managers at Schuster's department store. So Clement got elected and was a U.S. Congressman. Clement Zablocki, a Democrat from Milwaukee. So of course, being from my father's business, Schuster's, where JFK visited, um, he 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 obviously so we went once when we were a toddler with my sister was alive, the four of us, my mother and my father. We I believe drove to Washington D.C. and as if I recall correctly, we visited the Democrat U.S. Representative Clement Zablocki for one day and or one night at his nice new large house in Washington D.C. because he knew my father was a friend of my father's from Schuster's, but also back in those days, more importantly to us, he was the only person that our family knew of. And again, I'm just a toddler down there, so I'm not, authoritative. But the four of us are all there, my sister and myself. He was the only national politician that we knew of who was the Polish ethnic heritage, and we obviously have a Polish family name, and so with SKI. So we visited Clement Zablocki one day. I believe we slept at his house overnight. He had a large house with a guest room, and he knew my father from Schuster's. So my father was a rank and file Democrat. He always voted for all Democrats. He never voted for one Republican, and he only mentioned that to me, I believe, in the 1980s when I asked him. If I didn't ask him, he didn't mention to me who he voted for. My mother and father never had a political sign out in our yard or anything like that. By the way, nowadays that requires months of advance notice in Fox Point. You have to have all sorts of permissions from the local village government. So, my mother voted for mostly Republicans, and she did volunteer her opinions. Two exceptions were I got her to vote for the Democrat Jimmy Carter because her teenage son, Nicolay High School in 1976, and I campaigned for the liberal Democrat Udall, a couple of volunteers. So she voted, crossed over. She was normally a Republican, but she had no friends or contacts in the Republican Party. She was mostly interested in the local school, the Bayside Elementary School, and the Nicolay High School, where she later worked as a reading teacher and substitute. So she had, not a lot of serious interest in politics. She also voted after Kennedy was assassinated. She also voted after JFK was assassinated. Since JFK, met my father and accepted a cake, then she voted for Kennedy's successor, the Democrat Lyndon Johnson. So she did tell people at cocktail parties. She voted for a couple. Her husband's probably a Democrat, but she voted for. Well, she would tell people at cocktail parties if they asked her that she's mostly Republican, but not an official member of their party. She never campaigned for them or anything, but she did vote for a couple Democrats. where she would mention that in public at cocktail parties. She voted for Jimmy Carter, probably because I campaigned for Udall, and she voted for Lyndon Johnson because JFK visited my father's place of employment and he gave him a cake. And she was very saddened that he was assassinated. One of my mother's proudest moments came the year she died, which was 2020. She was hanging on, struggling against cancer, and she told me she was very proud of this. She never gave the Republican Party one penny. She did nothing for them. She never volunteered. She only voted for their candidates. And, being my mother's son, I felt she was mostly or entirely a local person and that she was mostly interested in the local school district. Unlike my other relatives who went to schools of nursing and became nurses, I have several relatives who became nurses. My niece, my sister, and my half sister all attained the schools of nursing in Milwaukee, and they were on dean's lists and stuff, and they graduated with nursing degrees and worked as nurses and nursing instructors. But my mother and I just had a Bachelor of Arts degree, a B grade point average. My mother had a C grade point average from UW-Madison and was in a sorority. And so she voted for mostly Republicans, but we never had a sign in our yard. She never campaigned for them. She had none of them as friends or anything. This topic never came up seriously other than humor at, cocktail parties. So my parents did go to a lot of cocktail parties, and my father was known to be quite a life of a party, but with a lot of funny jokes. But neither of my parents really, I don't think, directly said anything about politics in public. So I would have no idea why a voice would be persecuting me on this other than using me as a scapegoat to intimidate some other rich people or something, which is what I was told by private investigators in 1987. They told me, this is very difficult to explain, Michael. You're calling from the newspaper, and why are rich people persecuting somebody like you, who your sister works as a nurse, her income is always 2 or 3 times what yours is, and you feel you're under unlawful surveillance at the newspapers from some very rich private people someplace in the world, and it's around your apartment and off your job, and you've called a couple private investigators, so they told me I had it correct. I was under illegal surveillance, and they both seemed to know about it, and neither one were going to charge me money, and they just free of charge, they're required to tell me that I would not understand this, it would not make sense to me, because didn't make sense to them. But I was being used as some sort of scapegoat among rich people, where I was trying to order it spying on me at my apartment in order to dictate to rich people who are homosexual to date heterosexuals or something like that, or people who are heterosexual to date homosexuals or something like that. Now, my father died in 1985, and he did, as I said, I'm kind of an easygoing, scatterbrained person. He did mention something like that to me, that he was only offered 1 or 2 national jobs in his lifetime, and to my shock and amazement, he turned them down. But he did explain to me he was offered a national buyer's job in New York by Schuster's, where he worked for. He normally only told me stuff once. He was a business-like person. And he said, there are different reasons why he turned it down. The main reason he turned it down, this was his second marriage. He wanted to keep his wife and myself and my sister, his family. He said if he took their national buyer offer for Schuster's, he'd be stationed in Milwaukee half the year and in New York half the year. Now, back in those days, that was a good deal because the company would pay for everything. In other words, They'd pay for his New York motel room or apartment. They'd pay for all his furniture and expenses and stuff. Back in those days, the companies used to pay for that stuff because it was them, making the person live there or whatever. So to make a long story short, to make a long story short, to make a long story short, my father did stun me. I was a little kid. We're gonna split up. I was gonna be willing to help him as his navigator in the car, and I was gonna be willing to mail my homework into elementary school because back in those days, I just got B's or C's or something in young elementary. When I got to middle school, I developed an A- grade average. High school, I was B plus. In college, as I said, I was hanging on with a B average at UW Madison. I was never off the charts, and I was never took an IQ test that said I was in the genius range in anything. The highest I get in anything is 90, 90 in math, but also 90 in the creative writing component, that factor within general English. General English is 87. Those are all fine, stable scores. 83 in science, 87 in general English, and 90 in math. They're all above average or average, but so and my father did explain to me the homosexual angle. He said he did not have a good mind for making things up, and he would ask me in childhood, myself and my mother, if when he would do like a business, if he had to write an advertisement or write public relations or write like a business report, he would ask my mother and I to help him because he was not a good writer. He could not imagine things well in his mind. That's why he was in business. He just knew to tell people blunt realities. He didn't know how to like sugarcoat things, or he was not able to be extremely tactful. So he just told me, I asked him why I was in favor of it. I'd be his navigator. My young toddler sister would stay with my mother. They'd stay at the Milwaukee house, and I'd go out to my father's New York place with him. And he said, well, first of all, this is his second marriage. I didn't know that in childhood. He and my mother decided not to tell me that. So, but it was his second marriage. I had a half sister from a previous marriage that they were not willing to tell me about until I was in high school. I felt they waited too long. So he said, well, he didn't want to wreck his marriage with our family. So he wanted to stay in Milwaukee, so he turned it down. But he did tell me one of the reasons was, yeah, living in New York, he'd be expected to sit in a motel room and sort of date homosexual men. Now, the reason he would tell me something like that is because his mind was just not able to make things up. My mother and I are, better at writing than him, and I'm not real good at that either, but we're able to visualize stuff in our heads a little. Neither one of us are off the charts in that, though, or anything like that. But he's not able to visualize stuff in his head real good. He has to march around and, do it in the real world. So he was in business all his life, mostly in retailing and sales. As I said, 25 years for Schuster was about, I think, 10 years at his own small retirement luggage shop, and about 15 years at a photo finishing plant, GAF, photo finishing, which nowadays those have become extinct because, the cameras, the photos develop themselves and they're digital on the internet. So, but he had difficulty, like, sugarcoating stuff, making things up. So just, mentioned to me, he's not going to take that job because they're going to want him to sit in a motel room and read a pile of books and be away from his wife and children. And they're going to want him to chain smoke filterless Chesterfield cigarettes, which is, he was smoking those anyway, but maybe he wasn't chain smoking them. So he turned that one down. Then when he was retired, he turned another one down. He had a friend of his who was a millionaire, and he was running his own retirement luggage shop. And the the place they were at the mall, the guy, the salesman for the mall, had lied to them pretty badly. Well, first of all, my mother wouldn't give him all the money he needed. He wanted to open a legitimate luggage store in the Northridge shopping mall in Milwaukee, which was a large legitimate mall. By legitimate, I mean, 99% of the spaces were rented by tenants who were selling stuff. So my mother wouldn't give him all the money he needed. He was always modest with something like that. He needed a larger mortgage in order to start his own retirement shop because his company had mandatory retirement at 65. So she was very difficult with things like that, extremely stubborn and tight. So he had to make do with a smaller mortgage than what he needed. So opened a shop at a new shopping mall, and the guy there was a big bullshitter. He didn't have all the spaces rented out. He only had half the spaces rented out. And within a year or something, a lot of them went abandoned and took off. And within a year, it was like it was a sort of a ghost town mall. Only one out of five spaces was rented out. The other four out of five were empty. Fortunately, he was toward a front area where there were some other stores, like a drugstore and stuff, so there was some foot traffic. As I said, he had his own luggage store at a couple of places for approximately 8, 10 years. His main thing, though, he was at GAF Photo Finishing 15 years, and he was at Schuster's 25 years. Those were his two main, scores on his resume. So we didn't get the profit that we should have gotten because it was too lousy a shopping mall. And so anyway, I forgot whatever the point I was making. So but so as I mentioned, if you think about it, my mother was sort of a quiet Republican. She voted mostly Republican, but she was never. Oh, the point I was making is she was struggling against cancer her last summer in 2020. And it was one of her proudest moments, even though she voted for Republicans. She told me, as I mentioned, my mother was a sort of a moderate, quiet Republican, and she did vote for a couple Democrats for president, Lyndon Johnson, because she felt badly that JFK was assassinated and then he met my father, and my father gave him a kick. And also Jimmy Carter, because I went down there and campaigned for, at that time, the liberal Democrat. I am reminding them how that worked in those days. The liberal Democrat from Utah visited our high school. He was the only one. So I went, to pay him back, I went downtown and volunteered to work a phone bank for him on one or two weekends. And I was only in high school. I didn't meet anybody down there or make any friends. My mother always used to ask me, she ever go, when you ever go to those nightclubs down there, you ever meet anybody or make any friends? So in the end, as the 1970s rolled on, my parents sort of asked me a little to transfer from UW Milwaukee to UW Madison because my mother would ask me when I get home, like on Saturday she'd ask me about Friday night. She'd go, "Did you ever meet anybody down there or anything?" And I really didn't meet a lot of people. I just had I had friends mostly through daytime recreational sports in high school, and I had friends from the fraternity in college and from the dorms, and so the nightclubs were like meat markets. They were heavily dance clubs. I liked them, but a lot of people complained about them. A lot of people went to them and spent money at them, and a lot of people that had the complaint that I just mentioned that their meat markets, you don't really meet anybody intelligent in a place like that. It's a little like being in a jungle in Africa. There's a hippopotamus over there, there's a lion, there's a a monkey or something. And I mean, I like the variety of it. Being interested in liberal arts and majoring in journalism in the journalism school, a variety of people at those dance clubs. But my mother always used to ask me though, when I, the next day, Saturday, or when I get home, she'd go, "Do you ever meet anybody in any of those, clubs in downtown Milwaukee?" And I don't really remember, other than my college friends, people I knew in college who I already knew from college. That's about it. My mother was pointing that out. Her friends were all from her sorority at UW-Madison. That's what she was pointing out to me. And whenever I ran into anybody, it was mostly through the UW-Madison. It wasn't, those weird meat markets were like downtown jungles or something with, all different animals in them. And so what was the point on, these rambling stories? I can't remember the original point. I'm over an hour on this one. I don't remember what the original point of this one was. Oh, I was pointing out it's one of my mother's proudest moments, her last summer alive in 2020. Her husband gave a cake to JFK, and so she pointed out, and she voted for most of the Republicans, but neither of them had a sign out in the yard. Neither of them campaigned for anything. And I'm saying the only reason I can't volunteer for anybody is he volunteered to visit my high school, so I volunteered to campaign for him. And Morris Udall, and he happened to be a liberal Democrat. So, uh, one of my mother's proudest moments in 2020, she told me, even though she voted for mostly Republicans in the voting booth, and even though I'm telling her I'm voting for Democrats at least half the time, I'm nonpartisan, independent. Even though my father is a rank and file Democrat, only tells you once in your lifetime he voted for all Democrats. He told me that was the correct strategy. That's what he told me. 1980s, he said, I've noticed your employment a little, Michael, because I was living in his house, and you're out at my luggage store, and you're at Sears and community newspapers, and you got a college degree, and he said something like, when I go in the voting booth, I just pull the Democrat lever, and that's the way it works in Milwaukee if you want to be working, want to be employed. So he did tell me that once. He said, when you're voting for both of them in there, that doesn't help you with employment when you're young like that. He said, even though that's supposedly private in a voting booth, he told me he just pulls the Democrat lever, and he did that his whole lifetime. And he was always employed in Milwaukee at Schuster's, GAF, and his own luggage shop. Anyway, my mother voted for mostly Republicans, and she was mostly around the house, though she did meet my father at Schuster's, where she was an advertising writer back in those days, and she did have a better job. She worked as a secretary at Rexnord, which would have been her permanent career job, or the job at Schuster's, either one of them. And she left, I believe it was the Rexnord job for a maternity. They did not have maternity leave in those days, so she was very disappointed. She had to quit her permanent job in order to give, birth to me, her son. She always complained about it. They didn't have maternity leave back in those days, and she has to repeat things to somebody like me a lot because I don't remember stuff. Like I said, I'm scatterbrained, and she uh, she repeated that a lot, that they didn't have maternity leave back in those days. She was like an executive secretary or something at Rexnord, and that sounded to me like a permanent job. And also she was an advertising copywriter doing department store catalogs at Schuster's downtown, where she met my father, and those both sounded like permanent jobs to me. And she had to leave them in order to. I was born in 1957, and my sister in 1960. Now, we did have a half sister, and we were both suspicious, and our parents were very cautious, very conservative with that. They didn't tell us we had a half sister until I was in high school. And I had campaigned all throughout our family life to tell me something. I knew they were withholding something, and finally in high school, it might have been my father who admitted it. He had been married once before. His first wife had died in her 40s, and he had one daughter with her named Christine. And so now he was finally giving me permission in high school to meet my half sister. I was, of course, extremely angry that I didn't know about something like that until high school. This is back in the 1970s, probably. And my sister also, we were both very stunned and surprised, very angry that they wouldn't tell us this. So, but anyway, um, anyway, well, the point I was making is my mother, one of my mother's proudest moments, 2020. Well, first of all, a moment I'm proud of. Neither one of them ever had a sign for either of the major political parties in their yard, ever. So I am somewhat proud of that. Our yard was never had a political sign in it. That's one thing. And another thing was, even though she voted for 90% Republicans, she she never gave them one penny. And she mentioned that to me. She was fighting against cancer, and there were hundreds of automated phone calls from the Republican Party. And obviously, dying of cancer, she died before the 2020 election, and she did not make it out for the 2016 election. So she never voted for Trump, even though she was a moderate Republican, a quiet Republican. And so she's mostly interested in the Bayside Elementary School and the Nicolay High School. She not really, none of us are really into politics. So, and she had been a writer at Schuster's. So then. But she was very proud there. She didn't vote for Trump. She couldn't make it out into the 2016. She uh, was too old, no longer drove a car, and did not make it out to the voting booth. And of course, being a nonpartisan independent, I'm not going to remind her to, that you can vote at home, a mail-in ballot. I did not. I either didn't know it myself or didn't remind her. But in any event, um, so she was very proud in 2020. One of her proudest moments that even though she voted for 90% Republicans, she never gave them one penny. She never officially joined their party. She never campaigned for them. There was never a sign in their yard, and she didn't give them 1 cent. One of her proudest moments as she was fighting against cancer, she told me in the house when she died, I believe it was September 21st, 2020, and she was born September 27th, 1928, and she lived to be 91, almost 92. And in this political commentary, she never gave one penny to any political party. She never joined either one of them. No signs in her yard. Also, my father, he only told me once, and he explained to me why. Was always employed in Milwaukee, and he told me just once, in a place like Milwaukee, you've got to walk into the voting booth and just pull the Democrat lever, or you'll never be employed around here. You'll just, because it used to be back in the 50s, 40s, or whatever, ethnic Polish and ethnic German and ethnic Irish and ethnic Italian. And he said to be employed at these factories and stuff, whether it's as a collator, a factory worker, or as a salesman, as my father was, you just vote for all Democrats or all Republicans, but probably all Democrats. Anyway, I believe I've mostly been an independent, nonpartisan voter. I didn't know that, and I so I just said a brief listing that well, I'm not gonna review it because then it'll be taken out of context. Whatever that was is what it was. And the legendary Democrat William Proxmire, who was very popular with both political parties in Wisconsin, did help me out. I was at Hometown Incorporated, and they owed me. My father died in 1985, and they owed me a week of funeral pay, which they had promised me. They had not promised permanent employment. I was supposed to be temporary in telemarketing and marketing work there. I wrote their spring newsletter for them, filling in for the ad writer who was on maternity leave, and I tabulated statistics for them about their customers, also called marketing. And I mostly did telemarketing work for them from my house and from their office. And I was supposed to be there only 2 weeks, and I was there 8 months. And they could never put me on their, they wanted to put me on their permanent payroll, and so did I. I wanted to work there permanently, and we weren't able to because the other companies complained. They kept describing me as a news reporter. Actually, I turned out to be more of a wire editor and sports editor, but the other companies in the heating oil business kept insisting that they would blacklist Hometown if Hometown hired me permanently. My immediate supervisor was the son of the owner, and he would always reflect me coming into his office. I would visit his office every day, to do like office politics. So he always reflected that. He'd march out of his office, march up to his father's office, and show him that I was in there trying to get a permanent job. And he came back to me with the bad news. If they say I'm permanent at Hometown, their whole company will sort of be blacklisted. They heard through the grapevine I can only according to that I can only be a writer in Milwaukee, or can only be a reporter at the Milwaukee Journal, or I can only be a reporter or something like that. So the truth, what turned out, my most serious writing work in Milwaukee was for the Milwaukee Business Journal, and they had the same argument. They said, I went to them after Hometown, and they said, we can't, unfortunately, we can't hire you permanently. You can be like Walter Cronkite. You can be the best, reporter anywhere, and we're not able to hire you permanently at the Business Journal. So I was obviously disappointed. Anyway, around that time, I went to William Proxmire's office. I contacted them, and they mailed me instructions for how to get the funeral pay from Hometown. So I followed them. Hometown was approached by a government agency on my initiation of that, and so Hometown did begrudgingly mail me the 1 week of funeral pay. They were the ones who insisted, because I was temporary on their payroll. They were friendly to me. I was supposed to be temporary 2 weeks. They left me temporary a month or two, and then they took me off the temporary agency's payroll, which in Milwaukee they make a big deal out of it because they have to pay a large fee to the temporary employment agency, and obviously bringing you on board, they back in those days they have to give you an hourly pay raise. So they did put me on their permanent payroll, and they did take me off the FlexiForce's payroll, and they had to pay the large fee and give me an hourly raise. And I was only supposed to, I'm hard of hearing. I thought the owner's son there, I thought he gave me the orders or the instruction that you're supposed to get 2 to 3 sales a day, which is what I was doing. I'd get 3 sales a day and I'd stop, and then I'd start tabulating math statistics about the customers, or I'd pass the time talking to other salesmen in other departments because I wanted to work there permanently. So his original instructions were to get 3 sales per week. I'm a little hard of hearing. I thought he said 3 a day, so I was getting 3 a day. And on that basis, they took me off the temporary payroll. That didn't make any sense because they were paying me a commission or wanted to pay me a commission. So in order to pay me the commission, they had to take me off the temporary payroll and put me on their permanent payroll. And I guess it was more than they planned on. 3 a day is a lot more than 3 a week. So I would do 3 a day, either from my house or from their office. And then I would go out and play golf, or I would sit there and when I was in their office, I'd have to, come up with work to do. So I'd go around and talk to people. I'd tabulate math statistics about customers, also called marketing. And I filled in for the ad writer who was on maternity leave, and I wrote their spring newsletter for them. The reason they thought I was a reporter, I didn't hear correctly. I probably had like a month to work on their spring newsletter. I believe I wrote it in 2 days. That was a lot faster than what they wanted. So again, I'm hard of hearing. I must not have understood. So what they did is they gave me permission at some point to do the work at home. That was a way of phasing me out because I was going to the supervisor's office every day and mixing and making conversations with them to get hired permanently. That should be the best way to do that, by the way. So they had these big customer lists from a computer. They gave me permission just to take them home, and so I would get 3 sales, like it's a regular day, a good day, a busy day. I'd get 3 sales in the morning, and I'd go out and play golf in the afternoon. That was my 8-hour work shift at home. At their office, I have to pretend for like 4 hours. That's why I'm going in the supervisor's office and talking to him. Is following their directions. I stop at like 3 sales, and it's supposed to be 3 a week, and I'm getting 3 a day. By the way, that supervisor knew how I was doing that. He gave me some good advice, which was leading to that. That's why I got along with them. They gave me a good setup. It was set up. I don't, you don't tell people how do you get sales. Well, you don't tell them how. But at that company, they had it set up. Uh, You'd have to be a fool not to get the 3 sales a day or whatever. Could have gotten more than that, but I felt the being temporary, that was enough commission money for them, and so I would just start to stop around there. And now I did phone sales at the Performing Arts Center, and I was just average with them. It was the same year, 85, the year my father died. I was at downtown Milwaukee in that one for month and a half, several months, and I was a part-time telemarketer. Out of 20, I finished 10th, so I was just average with them. But with Hometown, I was off that guy's charts. He only wanted 3 a day, and I was getting, or he only wanted 3 a week, and I was getting 3 a day. So I was off his charts. So I went from there to the Business Journal like he predicted. He told me our company would be blacklisted if we hire you and say you're permanent telemarketer. He told me he used to be a school teacher. Okay, he used to be a school teacher. Then he accepted a job with his father's heating oil company. He said, I have to describe you as a reporter or journalist throughout the whole thing. Otherwise, they won't even let me hire you for the temporary 8-month job. I have to keep telling them in the management upstairs that you're a writer or a reporter or something, or they won't even let me hire you for the telemarketer job. So I did pass some of this on to William Proxmire, the U.S. Senator, because as I said, my father had been a friend of Clement Zablocki, the rank and file Democrat, the only one at that time that I knew of with a Polish family name where we could identify him as where his ancestors came from Poland. So Hometown was withholding the funeral pay so they wouldn't be aligned with me because they had to keep announcing that it's just temporary with telemarketing. Well, that's not true. I could have done that permanently, but they weren't allowed. They had to keep saying I was a reporter. So they withheld funeral pay to look mean to, maybe that makes them look like a reporter or something like that. So I went to Senator U.S. William Proxmire, and I contacted him phone to mail, and he was conscientious. He was also frugal, like they like in Milwaukee. He would only spend $1 to get elected U.S. Senator. So he's like a Democrat version of my mother. She spent zero being a Republican voter. She didn't give him one penny. William Proxmire, in a average election for him, he would spend $1 to get elected U.S. Senator. That's how dumb this is nowadays. That's why I don't care what party they say they're in, whether they're a Democrat or a Republican. I don't care. They've got to spend billions of dollars to buy themselves what they're calling a job. They've got to spend like $50 million to get a job that they claim pays them $50,000 or $100,000 or whatever. That's why this country is filled with technicalities and red tape. Somebody would ask you what's led to all this red tape and bureaucracy nowadays. Well, what do you think? I have to spend $50 million in order to claim I'm getting paid $100,000 or something. That's ridiculous. Those are all red tape and technicalities, and the whole public, both the Democrats and the Republicans, are used to that, and they used to object to it. So anyway, Proxmire called me back. His office did, a staffer, and they gave me directions on the phone. You just go to that government agency, you fill out their forms with them, you mail them in, and you get your funeral pay. So that's what happened. The government represented me to hometown and got my funeral pay. And then technically, that's how I was a writer with hometown. Though I did write their spring newsletter for them. So I was in hometown for 8 months. I was generally satisfied with the experience. They did phase me out, as they told me all along. They couldn't keep coming up with temporary work, and they had to keep describing me as a writer, even though I was a telemarketer and marketing person. Like my father in Milwaukee, he was always a salesman mostly, but he also was sort of an assistant manager with the a plant manager and with the overall manager. He was usually like a vice president or an assistant, but he never described himself that way. He always described himself as a salesman. So I did get the funeral pay money though. Hometown begrudgingly got ordered by the government to mail it to me upon my following the instructions of the legendary Democrat who would only spend. Why would you call him legendary? Because a man only spends $1 to get paid 50,000 or 100,000 or whatever U.S. senators get paid. Okay, to me that's legendary. These people they have nowadays are ridiculous. I'm only gonna, Donald Trump. I'm only gonna spend $1 billion to get paid 150,000 or whatever the president gets, 500,000, and he thinks he's gotta meet some budget. Well, I only spent $1 billion in that one. Well, you know. Now I don't know how to make that into a punchline. You want to be a comedian, you have to make that into a punchline. I don't know how to do that. How do you make that into one sentence or two sentences, a punchline? I don't know. Well, I only spent $1 billion and now I'm going to get paid 150,000. That was it. That's the punchline in that thing. So, um, so anyway, uh, So that's pretty much it. So that's my I got a voice from space, and it wants to know. It's grilled me on this, given me the Inquisition, interrogated me in my head since 1988 for over 30 years. So that's my explanation. Our family mostly aligned with the rank and file Democrat, U.S. Congressman Clement Zablocki through my father's association with him at Schuster's department store in downtown Milwaukee, the largest department store back in the 1950s, where he was a friend and a co-worker of Clement's, and where we visited U.S. Congressman Zablocki at his nice, large new home in Washington, D.C. By the way, those people were friendlier back there. We didn't have any criminal background check or anything, and Zablocki probably let us sleep at his new house overnight. And I remember he had some kind of pine woods out in the backyard, and I believe we slept there overnight. Two toddler children, maybe I was 5 years old or four or whatever. And my sister was 2 or 3. And us not knowing we had a half sister back in Milwaukee, we didn't know that. So that's the VC Andrews angle on that. And then later on, I campaigned for one weekend or 2 weekends for the Liberal Democrat Morris Udall in my first voting election, 1976, because he was the only candidate who visited Nicolay High School. So that was my reasoning. Since he visited me at Nicolay and I went to his talk, I decided to visit with whatever volunteers they had in his office in downtown Milwaukee and do some telemarketing for him, volunteer campaigning. And then later, as I said, the legendary William Proxmire, legendary because any man only spends $1 to waste his time at the government in this country where they think it's good that they have titles like senator and congressman, official titles, and they think it's good that they go to prison and send each other to jail and stuff. And well, I only spent 500 million to get a job that pays 150,000 or whatever. So, well, I thought that was pretty good. Well, and none of them have Polish names nowadays. Uh, Poland's a valid country. Uh, so what they've got down there now is a joke. I mean, I'd have to come up with a punchline for that. I don't know, but so that's our thing. The voice interrogates me for 30 years, and it just gets the same thing. Clement Zablocki, Morris Udall, and William Proxmire, and then I'm a nonpartisan independent, and I've been voting both major parties plus some independents and write-ins, and never been a sign in my parents' yards in any of their houses. Also, all the technicalities and red tape, the law that the governments need 3 months' notice, and that you're going to put a politician's sign in your yard, and they have to have you fill out all sorts of paperwork for that. And so that's about it. They wanted to, again, the voice interrogating me, the Inquisition. Uh, that's pretty much it. And so I think I'm gonna be keeping this one private because I'm drinking coffee on here. My hair grew back. It's long enough. I need to comb it, and I'm way overweight. I'm unemployed at the moment. I have sort of an application in with the state of Texas to be a security guard in Houston. Again, that's all changed. When I first got to Houston in 2005, a security agency could put you out at a post that night. Nowadays, they hesitate to do that because of all the new government laws, and the security function has possibly been reduced in Houston. Under their laws now, you have to check in with the state first, and they can take, I believe, up to 9 days. The check-in with the security company might still be one day. They used to do it all in their office, the fingerprints and stuff. Nowadays, they don't. They have these, through state rules or state laws, they send you to a fingerprinting company, and you have to do it now yourself. The secretary in the office used to do it for you, putting the paperwork on the internet of your security certificates, like level 2 and level 3 and stuff. Nowadays, you have to put it on the internet yourself. The office used to do that for you. So that's pretty much it on that. And well, I've only lived in Houston in Texas, and according to a TV set, I mean, we were told we were, again, had better educations than nowadays. We were told way back in toddlerhood, that's a boob tube or an idiot box, not to really take them seriously. According to a TV set, Houston here is Republican. I think they're mostly Texas people. There's a lot of international here. I think with their politicians, they do support Republicans, a lot of the Mexican Americans. But I think they're mostly people who are looking for jobs or working. They're mostly working people. So when I was in Milwaukee growing up as a toddler, the Polish South Side, those were probably at that time mostly independents or Democrats. Overall, I would say they're mostly independents, Democrats, or Republicans. They've over all the decades. What I mean is we moved out of there in 1965, but ever since then, over all the decades, they probably voted Republican, Democrat, Independent, or whatever. But back in those days, they were in our phase, they were mostly Democrats. This here claims it's mostly a Republican. Uh, but they seem like mostly Texas, mostly international. There's a lot of people here from different countries, mostly Mexico and South America. Uh, okay, I'm gonna wrap this up. This is at an hour and a half, so that's this thing.